We've covered many Spectrum software houses, and with that many Spectrum coders as well. In the days of the bedroom coders and the boom in the British software industry, there were quite a lot of those who were perfectly willing to get as much time in the limelight as they could. Meaning that, as ever, we go to imagine and use more footage from that commercial breaks documentary that I seem to use in every single video that I do. However, this time it's relevant again, because of the ocean half of the documentary that so happens to feature the subject of this video. Not a company, but a single person. It would be silly to try and do a countdown of the top ever Spectrum coders. You'd invariably miss some sort of obscure genius out, and well, how could you even list such things anyway? But of course there are favourites, people who certainly do stand out, especially in this world of games that were often created by just one person. But if I had to pick one myself as a favourite, well, actually it'd be quite easy. My favourite isn't someone who wanted the limelight. In fact, they shied away from it even if they could have easily got it. The games they created were certainly popular, not just with regular games playing folk, but with coders too, a lot of whom saw this man as an inspiration because it seemed that he could do things with the ZX Spectrum that others just couldn't. Aside from his technical brilliance, he was also one of the system's greatest ever artists. Genius is a word that gets bandied around a lot, but I'm not sure if there's any other word that could describe the man who also has the most boring name in the history of everything. Jonathan M. Smith. Also known as Joffa Smith, Jonathan Smith, or simply the guy who spells his name backwards. As he once said himself, with a name like John Smith, you have to do something to get noticed. Not a whole lot is known about Joffa's childhood aside from what the man himself put out there. He was born in 1967 in Widnes, a town on the River Mersey not too far from Liverpool that's mainly known for producing chemicals. Not that a life in such places was ever really one for him. Joffa was a creative soul from the beginning and would throw himself into just about any form of art that he could. He made short films, he made models, animations, paintings, all sorts, way back from when he was a teenager. On his YouTube channel you can even find an animation called The Fawn, shot on Super 8mm, that he made for his Art O level in 1983. Apparently he was the first person to create an animated film for this particular exam. So with all of this promising development in film and animation, how did he end up coding? He started on the ZX Spectrum when he was around the age of 15 and picked it up very quickly indeed. Clearly something about it appealed to him very much. Sometimes there can be a big difference between artists and coders. Usually you expect them to be two different people. Yet on the Spectrum sometimes the very best, well, they could do both. Or they just worked differently, not seeing binaries and hex, but something else. Just as an example, the graphic artist Juan Delcan had this to say about another genius 8-bit coder, Paco Menendez, creator of games such as Sir Fred and The Abbey of Crime. He had a very particular way of programming. He never did it in front of the computer. Instead he used to wander with his hands crossed behind his back, just thinking. He could do this for an hour, sometimes even more, and then suddenly you would see a spark in his eyes. He would then sit down in front of the computer and immediately begin to type lines of code so fast that you would think he was possessed. It was like watching someone playing the piano. His head wasn't thinking anymore. He was simply executing what he had already decided. Some people are just prodigious. Within a year of picking up the ZX Spectrum and learning how to code, Joffa had made 2 games for himself. One was The Fin, which by his account was a Donkey Kong clone type affair, and the other was a game called Pud Pud. He would send both of these games to Ocean Software in Manchester. Almost immediately, Ocean would bring him up to their offices to show the games properly. And at the same time, a BBC film crew, headed by director Paul Anderson, are filming at Ocean Towers for the purposes of a documentary. Here's the relevant clip.
16-year-old Jonathan Smith has just walked in with Pud Pud, a game that he wrote at home.
We'll be here to What's the object of the game, Jonathan? What's the thing?
Sales director Paul Finnegan helps to assess the merits of Pud Pud and of its young author.
It's about time life. You have to collect 10 puddings.
How long did it take to write this from the
About
beginning?
7 weeks.
7 weeks. And how long have you been programming?
About a year.
About a year.
Ward likes Pud Pud so much that he pays Jonathan £1,000 for it and gives him a job at Ocean. But he knows that it's not the Christmas hit that he's searching for.
It's not exactly what you want when you're just starting out on a job, isn't it? It's probably stressful enough that you're showing off your new game to both the sales director, Paul Finnegan, and David Ward, literally the boss of the company, but you've also got a camera in your face as well. Joffa, as mentioned, wasn't someone who sought after the limelight and was never good socially. In interviews he did indeed say that this wasn't a particularly nice experience for him, but that the footage was up on YouTube so that you could see him die. And sure, the awkwardness is palpable. Still, one thing is clear already. The 16-year-old Joffa spent 7 weeks programming Pud Pud. It's an excellent game and he's, well, something of a talent. As mentioned, David Ward likes it so much that he gives Joffa $1,000 for the game off the bat, as well as a job offer. There was no real hanging around for him. Ocean wanted him immediately. Still in sixth form at the time, he'd also applied for the National Film and Television School, where, if he'd been accepted, in his words he could have been studying alongside Nick Park, later of Aardman and Wallace and Gromit fame. However, he chose to leave sixth form and take the job offer with Ocean Software. Not long after, the final version of his first game, Pud Pud in Weird World, is released to the general public in 1984. Now, Pud Pud wasn't a successful game or anything, but it's a great introduction to Joffa and the things that make his games stand out. Right from the title screen you've got this presentation, a cool title, a weird theme that gets crazier as it goes on, lots of colour. It kinda stands out from a lot of other games already. And then the game itself is also a standout. You play as Pud Pud, of course, and you have to eat 10 puddings that are dotted throughout this maze. Trouble is, only one pudding is in the maze at any time, and you're slowly running out of energy. You eat certain creatures to gain energy and keep yourself alive, but eating others will drain it, and if you ever happen to run into Mrs. Pud Pud, her kiss will instantly kill you. The location of the puddings is randomly generated each time you play, meaning you can't simply learn it all and forget about it. The game itself is a fair bit of fun, but what really stands out is the artwork. You get these big yummy sprites, broken ZX Spectrums, fists, cans, bits of the Statue of Liberty, the Joffa Says RIP stone. So much of it. Not to mention this completely iconic death sequence where Pud falls, bits of him dot the screen, a heart shatters and suddenly you get this whole kaleidoscope of colour. Again, these are things you don't usually see on the Specky. What with the colour clash and everything, it's not exactly known for super colourful games. And then you play a game by Joffa. You look at this game and think that, as was normal, a very talented coder is working with a very talented artist. But in the case of Pud Pud, they are one and the same. The sort of game that may not have been a smash, but it was certainly well received. And like a lot of Joffa games, you do fancy that a fair few people who would go on to code and make games themselves quite possibly played Pud Pud. It has been said of Joffa sometimes that he might have always preferred the world of film to the world of games, at least as an art form, but games were more immediate, and perhaps also more individual too. Something about the Spectrum completely hooked him. In Joffa's eyes, no other computer even came close. The ZX Spectrum represented freedom, a certain intimidating type of freedom where you have nothing but a blank screen in front of your eyes and you start from nothing, but freedom nonetheless. He had this to say in a 2009 interview with the Retro Brothers. "There is nothing better than stripping everything away and starting from scratch. There is nothing to work with, so you are free. And even though people slag the Specky off, it sorted the men out from the boys, programming wise. You just have to put the effort in, I guess. This just doesn't happen today. You can say to someone that they have a completely blank canvas, and they say yeah. And then they find out what a completely clear sheet of nothing is, and they run. Nothing. No math subroutines, no auto screen manipulation, no help. You are now on your own. Now go! Ah! It's better that they don't know. Not knowing hurts like hell. Calling a development kit routine to find the square root of a number isn't programming. Take control. Work out how to do it yourself and do it fast. That's programming. I would like to produce a super fast console that has nothing but a big screen and loads of memory. And that's it. That'll learn them. Joffa's enthusiasm for the ZX Spectrum was infectious, bordering on evangelical. The computer would never leave his heart. And in later years it meant that he developed a certain set of skills that companies would often take advantage of. In his own impeccably blunt words, he was considered to be good on the shit stuff. A lot of that shit stuff may be to come, but for now we're full on into the glory years of the dungeon, when Joffa's games would constantly cause people to wonder how the hell he was doing what he was doing. Wait, what was that? The dungeon? Well, yes, of course, the dungeon. The famed part of Ocean's Manchester base, mostly underground, where the programmers, artists and other game developers would be located. Sure, everything looks nice and clean and professional up above, where people wear suits and wash the walls and all of that, but then you go into the dungeon and, well, it's a game studio. Posters, probably lewd ones, takeaway boxes, cigarette smoke and so on. The floors may not exactly be the most stable or anything, and no one's ever going to be washing those walls, but it's a cave of wonders. And armpit sweat, most probably. The Ocean Dungeon was home to a true murderer's row of shit-hot programmers. A big chunk of the best coders and artists of the whole era were on Ocean's team, and Joffa was one of them. Life in the dungeon was, as such, very games codery. A long day sweltering in this incredibly hot underground space, before going off to a nearby pub for a couple of drinks and so on, the Square Albert pub proving to be one of the more popular haunts. Joffa himself wasn't the loudest of people, but he was the sort who'd pop up with something hilarious, usually when you least expected it, and his skill quickly earned him a lot of respect from both his fellow dungeoneers and the higher-ups at Ocean, naturally in a typically northern and brash way. John Woods, one of Ocean's co-founders, and as classically northern a man as you're likely to ever see, gave the Konami game Mikie to Joffa. A day later he had a look to see what he was doing, and Joffa already had 2 screens up and running. In so many words, and as jokingly as you would expect from a northerner, John told Joffa to just fuck off. Joffa's time spent in-house at Ocean would see most of his games published on the Imagine label, which they of course acquired from the fallen company in the wake of their bankruptcy, and lasted for around 3 years, comprising of 10 games, the bulk of his Spectrum softography. Most of these games were almost all 100% his, albeit they were mostly arcade conversions, although there are others where he played a vital supporting role in the development of the game. Let's have a blast through them. Con Strikes Back was one of the first projects Joffa worked on for Ocean after Pud Pud, and he did so with another young guy who would be considered a bit of an 8-bit legend, Nigel Alderton, who most of you will remember as the creator of the almighty Chucky Egg. Con Strikes Back is an odd sort of a game. The appearance of Con is down to his role in Con from 1983, a Donkey Kong clone which was one of Ocean's first successful games. You might expect this to be Con-esque then, and it is in a sense, but it's actually a conversion of, or rather heavily inspired by, the arcade game Mr. Do's Wild Ride, which is in itself quite Kongy. You go along this looping roller coaster track and you avoid the carriages coming at you, usually through climbing ladders, although you sometimes have bombs that you can chuck at them. You reach your goal at the end, then move to the next screen, and so on. It's a good specky conversion of what's a quite obscure arcade game these days. Not the most Joffa-esque of games, but a good one nonetheless. As far as Joffa-esque games go, well, the next one is perhaps the least Joffa-esque of all. Street Hawk Subscribers Edition, something which kind of created a bit of controversy for Ocean. People probably don't even remember Street Hawk these days, a US TV show that had all of 13 episodes, but Ocean got a license for it. Back then, adverts for mags and spacing catalogues were all agreed pretty well in advance, so it was kind of a case of having to meet very hard deadlines, especially in this case as Street Hawk was also to be sold through Crash magazine. The game ran into problems though, and delays followed. Ultimately it got a bit too much, and there were some people whom a copy of Street Hawk had to go out to. And so this Subscribers Edition, made by Joffa, Nigel and Mike Webb, was rushed out in literally no time at all to meet orders. It's basically a Defender clone, but with motorbikes. And, well, it wasn't good, and didn't really satisfy. Ultimately Ocean, apologetic for the delay, released a proper Street Hawk game in 1986, while Crash offered a selection of replacement Ocean games in its stead. On to much better things. One of Joffa's most important and influential works on the Spectrum was actually on a game that he himself didn't program, but he did do the music routine for it. Pin Pon. Here's the music in question. Now you may listen and wonder just what the fuss was all about here, so let's detail. The Spectrum 48K, of course, only had a single channel beeper. When you turn it on, there's sound. When you turn it off, there isn't. Usually this meant that music was rather thin on the ground. Even the biggest games such as, say, Ultimates, usually only had very simple music because there was only one channel to work with. And then you get this. It's like a full composition, with lead synth and drums, not to mention this massive wave of sustain and attack at the end. It was groundbreaking, and it kind of became a feature of Ocean's games going forward. Joffa's routine was simple enough. The drum sounds were created with interrupts going over the pulse modulation to essentially create two channels, which were then used by Martin Galway to create the music for the game. Joffa's name is indelibly tied with Pin Pon as a result of this, with the music being the most memorable part. The game itself, programmed by Doug Burns, is however a very solid conversion of the old Konami coin-op with the disembodied rackets, and a very raucous crowd shouting at the end of every point. Now we move on to a selection of games that, well, almost any of them on their own would be enough to put Joffa in a Specky Hall of Fame. Joffa's music routine was actually originally meant for a conversion of a much more popular Konami title, but he ran out of memory and time on it. And that game was Green Beret, or Russian Attack if you're an American. This game didn't have any music in the end. Not that it needed it, as it's one of the best conversions on the system. A frenetic and ludicrously addictive knife-a-thon, where endless soldiers with guns, mortars and jumping kicks are put to your blade. On the Specky, you didn't need a game to be arcade perfect technically and graphically. What was more important was getting the feel of the arcade, and Joffa's game nailed it. There's few Specky games that I've played more than Green Beret. I can put it on and easily lose an hour in it at a time, as short as it usually is. You simply die, get Joffa's signature command of stab to start, and you go again. No messing around at all, which is exactly what Joffa wanted. He loved immediacy and classic arcade sensibilities. This game is a classic, one of the absolute best games on the Specky full stop, let alone just arcade conversions. But here's the thing with Joffa games though. You could ask 10 different Specky fans for their favourite Joffa game, and you may well end up with 10 different answers. Mikie, a really obscure 1984 Konami game where you push students over with your rear end to find hearts that make up a letter to your girlfriend while being chased by teachers, cooks and everyone else, is another shining example. Arcade fans may not remember this one much nowadays, but Spectrum fans sure do because of Joffa's fantastic conversion. The playability is infectious and it looks so clean and simple, and yet there's a lot going on under the hood. Joffa considered the graphic routine for this game to be the most complicated thing he did on the Spectrum, in fact, and yet you wouldn't even notice half of it. You even get the literal rendition of A Hard Day's Night that also appeared in the original game. Sadly you don't get the headbutts that were originally in the Japanese version, but hey, what can you do? This is just a lovely, super addictive title. Absolutely a classic. Oh, and there's also Hypersports, as if the last two weren't enough. Konami's classic Track and Field had already had a roundabout conversion to the Specky anyway, by way of Ocean's Daley Thompson's Decathlon. But this time around, for Konami's sequel, they had the official licence, and they had Joffa. The result is a very colourful, fast and incredibly Joffa-esque game. Even the frickin' enter your initials screen is iconic. All the events are present and correct, ready to give your keyboard the right hammering it deserves. The long horse will, as ever, prove to be the bane of your existence. Don't forget to breathe during the swimming, try not to break your fingers on weightlifting, make sure you shoot the bird during skeet shooting, and hit moving targets in archery. It's just great all the way through. Again, a lot of people would put this down as Joffa's best. And perhaps if you were to show one game that had all of his signature touches, the colour, the sound, the gameplay and the art, perhaps Hypersports would be a good contender for his quintessential title, because it's just all there very quickly in this nice little cassette tape. Brilliant. Those 3 arcade conversions are all absolute classics, of course, but we're certainly not done yet. Why, there's licensed games too, including another one that utterly wowed specky people and made them wonder just how on earth Joffa did it. Cobra. As it goes, Joffa and Martin Galway had a choice to make a game on either Cobra or Top Gun, and watched both films. Joffa didn't like either of them, but thought that Cobra would make for a better vehicle for the game he actually wanted to do, which was essentially a Mario-style scrolling platformer for the specky. The end result is, at best, a very loose adaptation of the source material. Not that it matters because it's a bloody brilliant game, and far better than the rather bland film. You control something that vaguely looks like Sly Stallone, and in intense Joffa style you're headbutting enemies left and right. You've got to collect all the weapons in each level, usually through little jumping puzzles, guns and knives that will definitely help matters, even if you don't have them for long. A disappearing duck will tell you how long you have, although if you get hit you lose the weapon anyway. Only once you've killed most of the enemies might you feel good about grabbing the damsel who's running about. Once you do, and all the enemies are down, you move on to the next level. One thing I've not mentioned though, have you noticed just how freaking smooth this game is? The Specky always struggled with horizontal scrolling. That was one of its major negatives, especially when compared to the C64. It didn't have its own dedicated graphics chip. But then, Joffa comes along. Cobra has this smooth scrolling, this parallax effect. For Joffa, again, it wasn't as complex as something like Mikie was. Not that it wasn't complicated, but Joffa had a knack for understatement. He wanted to do more with it, even potentially having a bitmap picture in the background. But alas, he ran out of time and the game had to go out. The result is amazing, one of my very favourite games of his, a licensed game you just could never get away with now. Joffa's weird and wonderful take adds a big slice of irreverence and quirk onto a boilerplate 80s action flick, while also being an absolute blast of a game to play. Wonderful. Daley Thompson's Super Test was the sequel to Decathlon, and came out around the same time as Hypersports. It's not quite as memorable as that game, but as a souped up version of the original Decathlon, it works very well, with a whole bunch of brand new events. You've got rowing, cycling, tug of war, even penalties. Mostly it's good old fashioned button blasting and joystick waggling fun, the sort of game that absolutely laid waste to no end of cheap quick shot sticks back in the day. Jolly good. Mind you, Joffa didn't like this project. He worked on 4 of the events, most of which were rejigs from Hypersports, and it was a bit of a crunch, being both a quick cash-in on the success of Decathlon and one of the first 1-8K games that came to market. There was a big rush to get it ready for the 1985 ECTS show, but it wasn't quite finished. And so on the floor it was Joffa's job to frequently visit the Sinclair stand and surreptitiously reset all the speckies displaying the game, due to a bug that would cause the giant slalom event to loop endlessly. And then there's Terra Cresta, Joffa's last in-house game for Ocean. Now a lot of people love this one, and I think it's a pretty cool vertical shooter, a nice conversion of the Nichibitsu original. Joffa himself disliked it, saying that the game ran into technical issues and that the ultimate release was something of a botch job. Why did he hate it so then? Well, for a start he thought it was rushed. There's not a lot of Joffa about it to be fair, and it was coded in about a month. Secondly, the bodge job came because of a timing issue which was fixed after he left Ocean, something that worked on 1-8K but didn't work on the new +2 machines that had come out, and the fix for this gave the graphics a noticeable flicker. And probably most of all is that this is one of the most played Joffa games, mainly because it was actually a packing title for the aforementioned brand new +2 machine. All of this may well have contributed heavily to Joffa's passionate dislike for this title. One time he even took to his YouTube channel and chucked a watering can at a microdrive containing Terra Cresta, microdrives being what Ocean used to store their games. Archivists may well have howled long into the night at that one. It is a pretty popular game with people though, even if the creator himself was not a fan. Joffa's 2.5 or so years in House of Toshin had resulted in a lot of incredible games, without a doubt. Still, it always seems that people can be quite fleeting in the dungeon of the company. Is it something to do with the general conditions down there? Maybe it's something to do with Ocean famously not being the best at handing out royalties? Whatever it is, it's not uncommon for people to decide to form smaller teams and go it alone. And in 1987, Joffa would form one of these teams. A team that was going to absolutely rock the arse off the specky scene with their mastery of the machine. And yeah, they pretty much did that. The team in question was the Liverpool-based Special FX, and it was started up by Joffa and Paul Finnegan, who you may remember was one of the people who was watching over Joffa as he demonstrated his first game to Ocean. They would be quickly joined by a strong lineup of 8-bit coders and designers. Tony Pomfret, Karen Davis, Andy Rickson, Robbie Tinman, Keith Robinson and Jim Bagley would all soon join the fray, which started out in offices fairly close to the famous Cavern Club before later moving to the Albert Dock. Even though the team did consist and was formed by a great deal of ex-Ocean folk, inevitably Special Effects would form a very close relationship with the Manchester Giants. Indeed, Ocean would end up publishing all but one of Special Effects' games. Even if they weren't in the dungeon anymore, Special Effects folk would often be in Manchester. They'd see Gary Bracey, either at Ocean Towers or on his trips over to the office in Liverpool, and they would try to return from their trips with as much swag from the Ocean officers as they possibly could. The odd one out in this instance was one of their first games, Hysteria, a side-scrolling quite Rygar-esque affair filled with parallax by Tony Pomfret that was originally for the Commodore 64 and was published by Software Projects. Joffa converted the game to the Spectrum in all of 2 weeks, using his Cobra graphics routine. The game is undoubtedly better on the C64 due to the amount of time spent on this conversion, all of a couple of weeks, but it's still a perfectly fun little game to play. Joffa's role in the Special Effects office was that of being somewhat in the background. He and Paul Finnegan had their own private spaces, but again he would pop up when you least expected it for some fun. He was also never precious about the things that he had created, and was always very giving of his knowledge. Jim Bagley's first Special Effects Spectrum game, Guts, made great use of the Cobra graphics routine in some stages, and while the game itself wasn't the best received one or anything, it was a jump-off point for Bagley's stunning specky conversions later on, the likes of Cabal, Hudson Hawk and Midnight Resistance. Meanwhile, Joffa himself had an original game that he was working on. Surprisingly enough, his first proper, fully original game, no licenses, movies or conversions, since Pud Pud. It originally started out as a weird game called Angel, before evolving into the space shooter that would become known as Firefly. Firefly is a shooter with thrust-esque controls and a big map to go around in each stage. You have to destroy the pods that spawn enemies by stopping in them exactly and then triggering a self-destruct sequence. Your ship is pretty powerful, but you're at your most vulnerable when taking out the pods, so you've got to pick your moment. There's a Bionic Commando type map where you can choose your own path to the finish, you can teleport around the place. There's lots you can do, even if the game itself is fundamentally very simple. Firefly is rightly acclaimed as a classic. Technically it's one of the most beautiful things you'll find on the Spectrum. It's gorgeous and it just plays so cleanly. The big 128K boost definitely helps it a lot, and like many Joffa games it is as addictive as anything, especially when you fully get to grips with it. It got plenty of rave reviews as a result, and Joffa himself was very happy with the finished product. Indeed, Firefly would be Joffa's personal favourite game of the ones that he developed. As far as the Spectrum goes though, well, there wasn't too much more. Not as much as there was in the Ocean days, as the decade was coming to an end and the 16-bits were gradually taking over. Still, there are a couple more. Hyperactive is a fun little thing, and an interesting Joffa-esque idea. Essentially, it's an advertisement for Special Effects' games that was released for free on a 1988 Sinclair user cover tape, complete with promotion for the likes of Firefly and Guts. But you also get this fun and fast-paced little Defender-type game, complete with, as usual, Joffa's excellent artwork. It's a lovely little game to play, a bit of Joffa goodness that cost nought at all, aside from the price of the mag. Joffa's last commercial specky title would be 1988's Batman the Caped Crusader on the Spectrum. One of the stranger Batman games, this takes the form of an action-adventure with various puzzles for the Bat to solve over the course of 2 separate adventures. It's very decent, most famous for its flick screen style, which took the rarely used form of comic book panels. A very nice touch indeed that might be more memorable than the game itself, but the game is cool. There is one other little thing though that of course has to be mentioned. It certainly ups the coolness factor of his work considerably. In 1988 and 1989, with just 2 weeks to do it all in, he actually worked on 2 series of the cult sci-fi comedy television series Red Dwarf, where he would produce the animated computer displays. It may only be a very small role in the grand scheme of things, but considering how rabid the love for Red Dwarf still very much is to this day, it is still going after all, this little factoid undoubtedly makes his body of work all the better for some. Alas, this was his only work in television. Of course, the end of the spectrum wouldn't be the end for Joffa, even if it was undoubtedly his favourite platform to work on. He would take his talent to the 16-bit computers. And no, he wouldn't go to the Amiga. Joffa would instead work with the Atari ST, which in many ways was the 16-bit successor to the ZX Spectrum. It had similar problems after all, what with the lack of a dedicated graphics chip and everything, meaning that good horizontal scrolling required creative solutions. Hell, it even had the same AY chip that you would find in a Speccy 128K, so the games even sounded similar. What it certainly did have more than anything was raw memory, that old Jack Tramiel power without the price dealy, in which Atari sold their computers often based on having way more memory than the rest, at much less cost, with 2MB and 4MB models available way before anyone else had them. And hey, as Joffa said, his ideal computer would be nothing but a blank screen, but with a veritable crapload of memory. Really, they could have been made for each other. Special effects in many ways was a dungeon all of its own. There wasn't a whole lot of lighting in their Albert Dock offices, which in many ways reflected the games that they put out. Sometimes they would have a bit of a twist to them that could prove controversial. Say, their conversion of the Untouchables featuring a level where you had to protect a baby as it flew down the stairs. Not that that wasn't already in the movie, mind you. In the main though, they became renowned for serious and high quality arcade conversions, and this would continue into the early years of the 16-bits. Joffa's role as a leader, of sorts, isn't necessarily one that you would have thought that he would fit into, but he mainly did through simply having fun. As he once said, working in places like Ocean and special effects didn't really feel so much like a job, it felt more like being paid to do a hobby. Everyone mentions that even if he was shy, he did have a great sense of fun. You see that in his games, but it was very much true of him personally. And so most people who worked at special effects usually have very good memories of it. One of those classic game studios where everyone has a laugh, but the work still gets done without all the ridiculous pressure that tends to take hold these days. Joffa's 16-bit games were, by and large, pretty good as usual. Some of them were a little handicapped by factors such as time, as we'll see, but there's still plenty of good here. Joffa's port of Midnight Resistance to the Atari ST is, like most computer ports of the game, very good indeed. It doesn't have the wow factor of Bagley's Spectrum port, nor the 2-player co-op of the Amiga version, but it's rock solid in all areas and crucially, it's complete. There's nothing at all here that's missing, and it's almost like a souped up version of that already fantastic Spectrum game, especially with the music. Of course, there is Red Heat. We have to talk about this one, being one of the weirdest licensed games around and everything. It's a bad enough movie anyway, and special effects certainly knew that going in, so hey, you end up with this. Is it a good game? Well, no. Joffa himself said that the game was made in a few weeks, and it most certainly shows. It's a very slow and ungainly horizontal beat 'em up where you either punch or headbutt various enemies as they try to rush towards you, and there's also a few joystick waggling minigames where you break rocks to reveal the drugs inside. It's kind of rubbish. Still, what it lacks in gameplay, it makes up for in sheer weirdness. Certainly the first level emulates the movie perfectly, with everyone brawling in a bathhouse, lots of naked folk milling about. It's this weird tapestry of stark raving nude carnage. And then the hospital stage brings in the nurses in drag, as well as a little cameo for most of the special effects team. They appear as patients in the hospital beds in the background. One other thing, what's up with the look of the game? Well, that was Joffa's idea mainly. In order to avoid having to animate legs and speed up the process, they only made these large sprites for the upper body. Obviously you then hide this by showing the game in a sort of cinema scope. Joffa himself handled the Atari ST port of the game, which isn't much different from the Amiga aside from the lack of music. Not a good game at all, but worth looking at purely for its strangeness. Another Joffa Atari ST port, this time of a perfectly good licensed game, was that of Hudson Hawk. Certainly the platformer you end up with here is better than the miserable Bruce Willis movie. Again though, there are some things you might question. Why do we have this odd caricature of Bruce Willis instead of an actual proper recreation of him? Actually, you can blame Bruce Willis for that. He didn't want his image to be recreated in low resolution graphics. Seriously, it's thanks to Bruce's own vanity. Anyway, the game itself is absolutely fine, with the Atari ST port having some cool music, and not all that many problems with the horizontal scrolling. Joffa never ended up working the same wonders in that department with the ST as he did with the Spectrum, but still, his games minimised the issue as much as possible. And we have another little Defender-esque freebie, Recoil, which was included on a cover disc for Zero magazine, and again, advertises a bunch of special effects games. It's much like Hyperactive before it, but it's a nice little bit of fun. Right at the end of the special effects years, Joffa made his first console game, albeit on a handheld, a conversion of the arcade classic Mr. Do for the Game Boy. Quite a few Spectrum programmers would actually end up working on the Game Boy, especially those who cut their teeth in the computer's later years. The two systems actually do have a fair few things in common, with both sharing a Z80 processor chip, albeit in a hybrid form with the Intel 8080, both sharing an AY sound chip, and both sharing similar restrictions. There's no need to worry about colourful graphics or anything when you're working on a Game Boy. The conversion itself is rock solid and the music is fantastic, although you might notice that there's actually no special effects branding on it. At around the same time, special effects was undergoing sort of a metamorphosis. The relationship with Ocean came to an end when, in 1992, Ocean stopped working with a lot of the third-party studios who were under their wing, which included special effects, who were utterly tied up with them, and not necessarily for the best of reasons. When Paul left Ocean to form Special Effects, Ocean took steps to control their interest, with Paul having been a significant part of the company. And so he had to sign an agreement that forbade Special Effects from selling any piece of software without first offering it to Ocean, and even if they didn't want it, they would then have a last chance to match any deal for a game that was offered to Special Effects by any other publisher. All this certainly explains why there was only one Special Effects game that came out without the Ocean name on it. Most other publishers weren't willing to work with them because of this. When Ocean, due to having spent a whole sack of money moving offices and what have you, decided to end their relationship with Special Effects and others, Paul Finnegan decided that it was best to draw a line under the company, and so it closed. Sort of. Barely 2 weeks later, a new company formed with much the same staff and in the same location under the name of Rage Software. Rage would also take a different direction, concentrating more on console games than computers. Perhaps they saw that ever so slowly the wind was beginning to blow more in that direction. The die certainly wasn't cast in 1992, but it was starting to roll. As for Joffa, it took a little bit of time for him to find his way to the new company. He went to Manchester and for a few months he worked at Software Creations. During this time he did the graphics for Spider-Man and X-Men in Arcade's Revenge on the SNES. A somewhat infamous game perhaps, renowned mainly for being incredibly freaking hard and certainly not thought of as a classic, but it does have music from the Follin brothers, and Joffa's graphics certainly aren't a bad part of the game. The bits that he did, which was mainly Storm and Gambit, are fine on the whole. Just, shame about the levels themselves and the playing of the thing. Joffa wasn't much of a fan of the atmosphere at Software Creations, although he doesn't say why. But before too long he was back on the Mersey with the old team at the new Rage Software, who'd just moved to new offices in Bootle, a dock town not far from Liverpool itself. Things at Rage were, as ever, pretty fine team-wise, although work-wise it would be a bit of a frustrating time for Joffa. Of the 3 games that he would work on while at the company, only one of them ended up being released. Cluster Buster was to be an arcade-style shooter for the SNES. It would be quite like Defender, but with 8-way scrolling, lots of explosions and general japes. I guess you could call it a bit of Defender, a bit of Asteroids, and probably a bit of Joffa's own Firefly. The game did get a little mention and some screenshots in Nintendo Magazine System, but alas Rage weren't able to find a publisher for it, and so the game was abandoned, and to this day no copy of it has been found. Tintin for the Mega Drive was the other one. A rough demo was apparently made after being commissioned by Sega, who wanted to try and get an exclusive contract for the character. However, this didn't go anywhere again simply because Sega weren't able to get the contract. The right holders for Tintin decided that they didn't want to go down the exclusive route. Meaning that, in the end, we have Power Drive, a Joffa game developed by Rage and ultimately published by US Gold in 1994. It's a pretty simple affair, a top-down rally game with various different stages. Personally, I get a little kick out of this one, even if I know that it's not the best game ever or anything. It's certainly not a quintessential Joffa game by any stretch of the imagination, and he himself wasn't a fan of it. But he did muse that at the very least, it was released. Even if there isn't really much to say about it at all, there is a little bit of fun to be had here if you're into the old top-down racing style. It's like a slightly bulkier Micro Machines. With the 16-bit era now starting to wind down, Joffa found his own interest in computer games gradually winding down. He'd been working on them for over a decade now, and perhaps the process was starting to get to him a bit, particularly as times were changing, games were becoming bigger, less immediate and arcadey, something that didn't hugely appeal to Joffa's sensibilities. If he'd stayed with Rage, his next project would have been a version of Striker for the Sega Saturn. However, he couldn't muster up the motivation for it, and he decided to leave Rage in the summer of 1995, and with it the games industry as a whole. At least for a little while. Now that Joffa has left the industry, things naturally get a little murkier. In a 2001 interview, Joffa said that for him the years between 1995 and 2000 were something of a blur, but that they did involve DJing in Blackpool. And yeah, that's pretty much all we know. It was a time when it seems as though Joffa wasn't really looking at games much at all. Indeed, through his life he often tended to stick to what he knew. He sometimes liked the look of more modern games, but he largely preferred to stick with the old stuff, particularly the games of his beloved Spectrum. But he wouldn't quite be done with the industry yet. In 2000, he would return to Rage. He didn't have much interest, and indeed never would work on the main console platforms of the time, but he would work on games for WAP phones. It was a way to get back in, and of course a way to, admittedly, make some money while making games that only really required his input alone. Alas, the one game that resulted from this, Airlock, is no longer available anywhere as a result. The only link that exists for the game, on Joffa's homepage, is long dead. Needless to say, that's a bit of a shame. After this, it appears as though Joffa moved into freelancing. He worked for several companies, mostly on games for the Game Boy Advance. Perhaps most interesting of these was a game called Fluffy, or officially Apprentice, for Software Creations that never came out. James Mackay was the lead programmer with Joffa assisting, which featured a 3D Doom-style engine on the GBA that was originally demoed on a project called Dungeons. The designed game would have been a Super Mario 64 style platformer where you guided an apprentice magician across the landscape with total freedom of movement. A demo of the game was rushed through to be shown to publishers at E3 in 2001, but for whatever reason Software Creations never showed it to anyone and the project was abandoned in May-June of that year. As far as games that did come out go, Joffa did a couple for the Cheshire-based company Warthog. Rippin' Friends, Looney Tunes Back in Action, and All-Star Baseball 2004. None of these games are particularly worth talking about much, it has to be said, and hell, Joffa was just a part of a team for these, so there's not exactly all that many touches of Joffa about them. As he succinctly put it, he was good on the shit stuff, and so he was put on the weakest project that the company cared the least about. The most interesting thing here is that Looney Tunes Back in Action is sort of a mini Spectrum coders reunion. Joffa worked on it, and so did former Imagine and Ocean programmer John Gibson, while ex-Ocean muso Jonathan Dunn supplied the game's tunes. There is one other game that he worked on with Warthog, the last potentially commercial title he would work on in fact, that would have perhaps been a suitably Joffa thing to end his industry career on. it would have been very Joffa to have your last game go out on, of all things, the Gizmondo. This weird game called Mama Can I Mow the Lawn does sound quite strange and possibly even a little bit Joffa-esque, more so than the licensed games he was usually working on, and it was apparently meant to come out for a bunch of formats. However, Tiger Telematics, makers of the Gizmondo, purchased Warthog in 2005 with the intention of having them develop games for the handheld exclusively. Needless to say, this didn't help the machine's already flagging fortunes. Tiger Telematics folded completely in early 2006, and Warthog Games went down with it. As for Mama Can I Mow the Lawn, well, the game was never released. And so Joffa was out of a job and out of the games industry, and he would never again work for another games company. However, in many ways this is the end of the more unclear wilderness years, the time that Joffa spent working in various companies producing games that were rather nondescript and, well, not very Joffa at all. In the final part of this, we have a whole bunch of little things to look at, such as Joffa's times on YouTube, times on internet message boards, and the odd little project that he did purely on his own for the systems he loved. He certainly made a bit of an impact in his last years. Joffa had a bit of a presence on the internet. His own webpage featured a whole bunch of little things here and there. You could find the Mr. Do source code there, as well as some more examples of his old school work from the early 80s. It seems as though Joffa, from interviews and what can be found on the old archives, had some sort of plan to put all of his stuff together in this one place, even if it didn't really work out in the end. Still, most other stuff could be found under his alias of Frobush, which he fought up due to being, in his and many other people's words, daft as a brush. There's a YouTube channel for example, featuring various antics from his home in Widnes, such as having a fight with a cereal box, or scolding some youths for throwing rubbish outside his house, or attempting to make pizza by cooking the much nicer looking pie on the box, as opposed to the one inside of it. Various daft antics such as lists that ultimately wouldn't be viewed by many people outside of forums, but they still exist. Forums would indeed be the place where Joffa did most of his interaction with people. He quickly found a home on the World of Spectrum board. Reading his posts certainly give you a lot of insight into the fun and creative mind of the man. Often they're pretty round the twist. In the midst of various random posts about crap television programmes, or things that annoyed him, or various horrifying looking convenience food mashups, there'd be little bits about games in general, or stories from the past. Some stories did get a bit of a Joffa slant. There's the one about an ocean cohort who once lost a Tate and Einstein and covered a specky in chocolate, or the one about a famous specky programmer who sent a nude picture of himself into a porn mag, or various fun back and forths with people like Doug Burns, a friend and collaborator from the Ocean days. There was also lots of little tidbits about programming and the like, little hidden secrets in games and what have you. For example, there's this little tidbit in Mikie where if you go up to the blackboard and shout at it 3 times, you get a goblin and a bonus. You probably wouldn't know about this without reading Joffa's post about it. A lot of people have good memories of Joffa from PMs and the like. He was always welcoming, a little mad, and down to earth to the point where people often didn't realise immediately just who they were chatting with. This sort of purely online interaction with people was something that Joffa was very comfortable with, and so he was always very good value indeed. As has been mentioned, he was never someone who was good around people. Unfortunately, there was an example of that in the later years. It's one that kind of hurts me to bring up a little, if only because it's something I kind of recognise in my own behaviour, but it's not something that can totally be brushed under the covers. In March of 2009 there was a retro event in Stoke-on-Trent called Bite Back, featuring an Ocean Reunited panel. There's little footage still available. Retro events were, back then, largely a much smaller and intimate affair, not so much the Play Expos or Revivals or NERGs of today. Anyway, Joffa was on the Ocean Reunited panel alongside various other faces of the company. A blow-by-blow account of what happened on the panel isn't needed. Suffice to say, it didn't go well. In the days after the events, there were some rather frank and heated words exchanged between people, particularly between Simon and Joffa. It was a shame. Joffa sums things up again with a quote. "Everyone has their agenda. Mine was to smile when I really wanted to run away." In any case, Joffa made the decision quickly that retro events were not for him. He absolutely wanted to do it, and he may not have even fully regretted it. At least he tried. But online was for him in many ways better. Enough about that though. In these later years there were also games. Sometimes just little tidbits, such as contributing some graphics to an MSX homebrew project called Retaliot from Video Hazard. But in the main, there was Saucer, a brand new Joffa Smith game that he worked on from 2006 onwards. At one stage he was in talks with the ZX Spectrum game publisher Chronosoft about it, and it's possible that if the game had been released, it would have been through them. Demos of the game do exist, but it was never finished. Without the hard deadlines that existed back in the Ocean days, Joffa was a bit of a perfectionist with regards to the game, and he did admit that at one stage the game was pretty close to finished when he decided to scrap it all and virtually start again, because the graphics had ended up taking too much priority over the gameplay. The lengthy development time for Saucer did result in a few jokey comments of, "Hey, when's it coming out?" after his posts, although there wasn't much malice or anything. It's not like this was a crowd-funded project or anything like that, because such things didn't really exist back then. It was more a possible new game from a specky legend. A bonus. If it came, it came. If it didn't, it didn't. But alas, it didn't. We now come to the end of this story. If you look at Frobisher's posts from 2009 and early 2010, as well as the details from some DMs that came out, he does at points mention his poor health, although he never fully disclosed what was wrong with him. There were occasional comments about potentially not being here next year that were just taken as Joff being Joff, self-effacing and random as ever. There was also the admission that Saucer was currently on hold for the time being while his health problems were being sorted out. In May 2010, after Frobish had been inactive on the forum for a couple of months, his old Ocean friend Tony Mr. Hat Pomfret appeared on the WOS forums to announce that his absence was due to a hospital stay, that he'd been in intensive care for a while, but was now slowly getting back on the mend with the help of a couple of operations. There were plenty of well-wishers, of course, and the hope that the little turd would be back soon. At times it even appeared as though he would be leaving the hospital, only to end up finding his way back there before leaving. Unfortunately, it wouldn't happen. Suddenly the news came through that his condition had deteriorated, followed soon after by the news of his passing. Jonathan Joffa Smith died at 10:30 AM on June 26, 2010, at the age of just 43 years old. The grief that poured from the Spectrum community as a whole can't really be summarised in words. Not only was he one of the greatest programmers to work on the system, he was a big presence on the forums where people still stood by the machine and, to many both offline and online, a great friend. Many people, both from the forums and from the old days, would share their memories of him, whilst the WOS forum got together and organised their own flower display for his funeral. A bunch of roses that simply read, Frobush. Joffa's impact on the ZX Spectrum scene is such that it's still hard to think of the scene without him in it, even so many years later. He would undoubtedly be happy that the Spectrum, his loved machine, has still stayed relevant through all these years. It hurts in many ways that he just missed things like the Spectrum Next, or the continued evolution of the homebrew scene that he may well have still been a part of, even if not at events then certainly online. A lot of his contemporaries and his friends, they're still here. I did not know Joffa, but in a weird way, through doing this, it almost feels as though I did. And you imagine that he would probably be happy to see that in many ways, the Spectrum is as alive as ever. As such, even if he has been gone now for 8 years, it's difficult to sum him up in something as final, as official almost, as a legacy. It's always tough to do this for someone who was taken well before his time. Even if a lot of the work that people knew Joffa for had taken place 25 years before he flew away, one can't help but feel that he had so much more to give. Joffa was a complete one-off, the sort of person who had so much talent that he could apply to, well, anything really, and be good at it. Be successful at it even. He had his faults, of course. He had his hang-ups, those things that reminded you that in the end he was only human. But one look at his body of work and the impact it had on the Spectrum, the world of games, the people who experienced it, and you kind of clam up. There isn't really enough words that could do it justice. What is perhaps true though, is that a lot of people still active in the scene are, in many ways, and perhaps knowingly, carrying a little bit of Joffa along with them. Perhaps it's best to end it all on a quote, partly self-effacing, partly whimsical, partly threatening, and totally Joffa. One day, we'll all get together again. Bring a gun. Bye for now. Many thanks for watching this video on the legendary Joffa Smith. If you like the video, please do like it, please do comment and subscribe and all of that. And also, please support me on Patreon for more documentaries like this one. I would like to say thank you to the following: Alexander Jazeri, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Daniel Briggs, Daniel Dave Taylor, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, Geordie Alex, James Loveridge, Jason Goy, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Kiwi Holloway, Lee Norris, Martin Pataki, Nicholas Tristan, Peter Jack, Filter Prog, Potter Margel, Pixels Limited, Quandy X, Rachel Maxwell, Ren Bimon, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Yerka Operator, Zach Roach, and all the rest of the community. Thank you and goodbye.